Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating dossier that maps out the invisible forces driving up your rent and, more importantly, lays out the legal blueprints it suggests you can use to fight back. If you've ever felt that awful financial squeeze right around the time your lease is up for renewal, you're definitely not alone. And according to our source material today, that squeeze is very much by design. Listen to this staggering whistleblower quote straight from the source material. The text investigates what it describes as predatory structures hiding behind those skyrocketing renewal notices, outlining exactly how corporate algorithms have turned the basic human need for shelter into a highly calculated, ruthless market. It's incredibly fascinating to see how the authors connect these dots, so let's jump in and look at the mechanics they've uncovered. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit the modern housing trap, look into the algorithmic price fix, break down the corporate landlord playbook, and then get into actionable tactics to counter hikes, wrapping up with building collective tenant power. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the modern housing trap. The authors of our dossier point to the 2008 financial collapse as ground zero for this whole situation. That's when massive institutional investors were able to swoop in and buy up entire neighborhoods in bulk. And the fallout from that? Well, the authors highlight a critical data point here. Everyday renters are now pouring 40 to 60% of their income straight into housing. 40 to 60%. The source notes that while our wages have essentially flatlined, rent growth has just absolutely exploded, trapping folks in a permanent state of financial survival mode. The text outlines a massive structural shift here in the housing market. We've really moved away from the classic mom-and-pop landlords, people who might actually live in your neighborhood, to these giant, centralized, multi-state corporate conglomerates. And the authors make a great point, because these massive entities are armed with centralized pricing software, automated evictions, and heavy lobbying power. You aren't just haggling with an individual anymore. You're confronting a massive, well-funded system.
Section 2, the algorithmic price fix.
Our source really digs into the sheer volume of data these modern pricing systems are eating up. Predictive software is analyzing massive behavioral data sets, everything from nearby rental rates and regional demand, all the way down to the exact mathematical probability that you specifically will renew your lease. The wild part? The authors note that the algorithm fundamentally ignores whether you can actually afford the hike. According to the dossier, its sole absolute objective is just maximizing profit across a gigantic housing portfolio. Now, the text uncovers a truly counterintuitive concept here called artificial vacancy. You might be wondering, hey, why are there so many empty apartments while rent is skyrocketing everywhere? Well, the authors explain that corporate landlords deliberately tolerate empty units. Why? Because keeping, say, 10 units vastly overpriced actually generates way more long-term profit than filling all 10 at a reasonable rate. It's wild, but the dossier reveals that vacancies are basically being weaponized as financial tools to artificially constrain the housing supply. All right, Section 3, the corporate landlord playbook. The text points out an absolute avalanche of what they call hidden fees. We're talking mandatory tech fees, valet trash fees, pet rent, you name it. Buildings layer on these absurd charges to technically comply with legal rent caps, all while quietly jacking up your actual monthly cost of living. And as the authors argue, to a tenant who is just trying to get by, a convenience fee feels exactly the same as a massive rent hike, right? This part of the source material breaks down some highly complex ownership structures to show where your hard-earned money actually goes. You might assume your rent check goes straight into local building maintenance. Well, not exactly. The text shows it's increasingly feeding global finance. Your monthly payment often flows right to offshore investment entities, private equity firms, and ironically enough, it even funds the exact political lobbying campaigns that keep renter protections so incredibly weak. And here is a huge takeaway from the dossier. Eviction filings aren't always about kicking someone out immediately. They're actually being weaponized as a business strategy. The authors suggest that rapidly filing for an eviction over really minor delays creates this massive chilling effect. It essentially terrifies tenants into accepting unjust conditions or unfair rate hikes just out of pure fear of getting an eviction record that could ruin their chances of ever renting again. Moving on to Section 4, tactics to counter hikes. Let's talk about leveling the playing field. To push back against all this, the source outlines a very specific blueprint. First up, you've got to gather leverage. Step 1 is researching your landlord's official ownership entities, digging into their tax records, and finding code violations. Step 2, document literally everything. Create an ironclad paper trail. The text argues that keeping records of neglected maintenance and taking dated photos of damage completely changes the dynamics of leverage. Next up, the authors emphasize arming yourself with knowledge of your local laws. Think right to counsel or repair and deduct statutes. Look, corporate property managers absolutely bank on the fact that most tenants just don't know their legal rights. But educating yourself allows you to seamlessly roll into step 4, negotiating strategically. This means treating your rent negotiation exactly like a formal business dispute, not just a personal plea. The authors actually suggest using this exact kind of highly professional framing to create leverage without unnecessary escalation. By writing a firm, data-backed response, like the phrasing recommended in our source material here, you're proving to corporate management that you know your rights, you've done your homework on local market data, and you absolutely will not be intimidated into just blindly signing an unfair renewal. Which brings us to Section 5, Building Collective Tenant Power. The source material really drives home this point. Silence protects these predatory systems. And that brings us to the immense power of the tenant union. The authors argue that by shifting away from being isolated individuals and moving toward legally coordinating rent escrow campaigns, renters can actually disrupt that automated advantage of the corporate landlord. It's all about collective bargaining and sharing your legal resources. And reclaiming local policy is the crucial next step outlined in the text. Remember, the rules governing housing didn't just fall out of the sky. They were created by political decisions. That means communities can organize to exert real political pressure. Whether it's pushing for vacancy taxes, zoning reform, or demanding corporate ownership transparency, the source makes a compelling case that organized communities can absolutely force systemic accountability. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to remember a core message from the dossier. A system's absolute greatest weapon is your exhaustion. These entities are banking on renters being too isolated and too tired to fight back. But, as the authors argue, with proper documentation, legal knowledge, and real solidarity, you actually do have a blueprint to push back. So we'll leave you with the text's ultimate question. Will you let the balance of power remain exactly as it is, or will you use these tools to finally shift it?